Good morning, everyone. So let's start the first panel of the day, South American Perspective on Peacebuilding and Stabilization. We will follow the order of the program and start with Professor Monica Hirst. Monica Hirst is a professor in the Department of Economics and Administration at Quilmes International University and teaches the MA in International Relations at Torquato de Pela University. Has published extensively on Brazilian foreign policy, regional security and integration, emerging powers, and cooperation for development.
Okay. Good morning. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Kai and Maíra for the kind invitation to be here today in the context of this seminar. I was thinking this morning, it came to my mind the little song, the Beatles song. It's wonderful to be here. It's certainly a thrill. Basically, because it is. It's been more than 35 years when I first worked with EDI, coordinating the first group of researchers who created EDI. And it's the first time that I participate in an international event organized by EDI since then, and since I left. And so it's really an experience, and it's wonderful to have such a full audience early in the morning. What I'm going to try to do here is very briefly give a general view of a frame of our region and our involvement in peacekeeping and peace missions in the post-Cold War period, I would say. And basically, I would like to the first thing I would like to do is unwrap the notion of region here. And I think that if we're talking about peace missions also, and in our region, we should think of Latin America and not only of South America. And I think that we worked with the idea of South American peace missions for a long time because of the importance of certain South American countries, Brazil in particular, in a certain phase of peace missions in the region. But now we can work with a more, I think, now that MINUSTAH is over, we can work with a more historical perspective, and that's what I'm going to try to do regarding our region. My first point, something I said on Monday, is that our region is an irrelevant region compared to others of the global South regarding contributions and regarding being a recipient of peace missions, particularly if we compare ourselves to the African region. This is not a bad thing, particularly if we think of ourselves as recipients of peace missions. And we don't have time to go into this, but there are very strong historical, cultural, and political reasons to explain why we are irrelevant as recipients. What I'm going to try to do in our 15 minutes is to give a very brief explanation, or at least certain reasons why, which speak of our specificity, of our particularity as contributors and as participants in the global scheme of peace missions. The first point I would like to underline here is the importance of, and this has to do with our history, the importance of the political context in the region to explain different moments in our participation in this agenda. I would like also, I should have started with this, and I would just briefly lay it out. When I think of our participation in peace missions, I think of three different moments, which means three different kinds of involvement in peace missions in our region. The first one has to do with the ending of the Central American war and crisis in the mid-80s, and the kind of articulation that was built up between the region and the process of pacification and democratization of this region, and particularly of our involvement as a region in the UN missions which took place in Central America at the time. The second moment, excuse me, the second moment is the MINUSTAH, which I would consider the golden days or the golden years of Latin American participation, involvement, innovation in peacekeeping in our region. And the MINUSTAH, as we know, lasted for more than 13 years. So it was a long period of experience and experimentation in Haiti, which has created, at this point, emblematic significance in the story of Latin American involvement in peace missions. And the third moment is a current moment still taking place, which is related to the peace process in Colombia, and how the peace process in Colombia, which has different phases. We're going through what I would consider the third phase now. And if we have time, we can get back to this probably in the discussions later on. But the experience in Colombia brings in legacies from the old days of Central America, but also is connected to a new moment and a new context of peace building in our region and in the global sense. So these are the three moments which I'll have in the back of my mind as I go through now the different aspects which I think are peculiar when we talk about but not bizarre, when we talk about our involvement in peace missions. Okay, so back to square two. The first point here is the importance of the political context. The political context in the region, the connections between domestic and foreign policies in our region as the background, as the motivations, and as the approach we take as a region in the peace missions we get involved in our own region. And ONUCA and USAO, which were the major missions which took place in the context of the peace building in Central America, were connected to, on the one side, the ending of the Cold War. No? Central America was part of the global negotiations at the time, and the process of democratization in our region. Our involvement in the Central American crisis and the peace building in Central America was very much connected to the first moments of democratization, our participation, our capacity to take forward, to go forward with political coordination, contadora, a group of support, and which later, and this will take me to my second point, which will later move to the group of Rio. Other political contexts have also been important. When we talk about the political context behind the MINUSTAH, we have to talk about a very specific moment of deepening of democracy in our region, the progressive governments which were in power at the time, the connections between these progressive governments. I mean, we know how important the ABC connection was for the MINUSTAH configuration. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, each one with their own progressive governments, and of course Brazil at the time taking the military lead, but Chile taking its own political lead, connected also to the connection, to the link between foreign policy and the political developments of the country at the time, the Lagos government. So here again, it's important to keep in mind the connection between domestic and foreign policy. And the third moment, which is connected to the Colombian experience, there again we have a different context in the region. Though the Colombia peace process benefited from the previous moment, which I was mentioning, of the progressive governments in our region, in the sense that the peace accords took place in a time in which the configuration, this political configuration of the region was very important. And the participation of Venezuela as part of the group of countries who were participating in the peace accords in Cuba was essential to bring in the FARC as part of the negotiations with a positive approach. Of course, the connections between Venezuela and the Chagas government in Cuba were essential. The second aspect I want to underline here regarding peace processes in our region has to do with the kind of connection that is created. It's fragile, but it does exist between regional multilateralism and the peace processes itself. There is a link which is always there, and the link, as I mentioned before, was invertebrated with the participation of the 8 countries who belong to, who led to the Rio Group creation, Contadora and support. During the MINUSTAH years, the participation and a certain involvement UNASUR had, and in the case of Colombia, CELAC. CELAC had an important role to play in the first moments and the first period of peace enforcement and verification of the accords in Colombia. And of course, there, the presence of the Cubans have been very important, because the Cubans have been members since the very beginning of CELAC, which didn't happen in the case of UNASUR or Rio Group. The third aspect I would like to underline here also, which is always there, related to our presence in peace, in these 3 moments of peace building in our region, is the presence of the United States. The U.S. is an invisible actor, but it's there. It's been there in Central America, as we know very well, and the first phase of the involvement of United Nations at the ONUCA and the disarmament of the Contras could only have happened with United States support and pressure, of course. It was there in the MINUSTAH. As we know very well, there is a political articulation for Brazil and for our countries in the region to be in the MINUSTAH with not only the approval, but with the applause of the United States. And it's, of course, there in Colombia, as the United States had a major involvement in the whole process of the last period of the war in Colombia. The fourth aspect I would like to underline is what I've been calling Latin American military agency connected to peacekeeping. Here what we see, and MINUSTAH was essential for this, is the whole, how could I say this, upgrading and expansion of autonomy of our armed forces in the articulation and in involvement in armed humanitarianism, and also, as we know very well in Rio, in Brazil, in its presence as an essential actor in the fight against organized crime. And this has, and from my perspective, a lot of explanations dealing with the involvement in peace missions. My fifth aspect, the fifth aspect I want to mention, is the development card. Our involvement in peace missions always brings in the question of development, the need to connect peace missions in peace and post-conflict context with the need to lead, that these processes lead to some kind of development, sustainable development possibilities in the scenarios where they take place. I don't have time, but this was very important, particularly in the case of MINUSTAH, but not only. It's there in Colombia now as well. Okay, I will just try to wrap up mentioning how does Brazil fit, very briefly focusing on Brazil and how does Brazil fit in the region. In this regional context. Brazil has 2 doors of entrance regarding its participation in peace missions. It has the global door of entrance, which is basically through the UN Security Council. It was sitting there in 2004 when the first moments of the MINUSTAH were configured, and it was there all through sitting as an inviter, as part of the debates in the UN Security Council during all the years of MINUSTAH. And of course, its connection, it expanded its connections with the UN headquarters, with the with Peacebuilding Commission, and there is there's a new link between Brazilian military, the Defense Department, and what goes on in peacekeeping all over the world, our participation in UNIFIL, etc. Our second door of entrance is regional, and here we have two kinds of questions. One is being a good neighbor, and the other one is being a good colleague, which is not, our grades aren't very high there, and neither one. And this is a complicated issue because it has to do with, back to the first point I mentioned at the beginning, which is our foreign policy and our regional foreign policy. And of course, our kind of involvement, responsibility, etc., with our neighbors in regarding peace and regarding peace processes. Our participation in the case of Colombia is quite fragile, weak, though we're there now for ELN, but it's almost symbolic. And the Colombians didn't want us there. One of the reasons is because we are neighboring countries, but also it has to do with previous unmet perceptions regarding the crisis, the conflict itself. And regarding being a good colleague, interoperationality in the MINUSTAH was a problem all through, and in the end, particularly in the last part. We went to Haiti together, but we left separately. I usually make a comparison between MINUSTAH and the Paraguayan War, which we fought together against Paraguay, but then each one signed their separated peace. It's not exactly the same, but there's some similarity. We have, and with this I'll wrap up, we will probably, though Colombia is considered the last armed conflict in the region, we do have probably a new scenario, I don't know in which future, but I'm very skeptical about the reality in Venezuela. And this might bring in new challenges for the region and for Brazil. And I think that we will be facing something that I could call an obsolescence of the Rio Branco legacy regarding our good neighbors and our capacities to deal peacefully with our neighbors, since we do suffer already very deeply and at borders from the Venezuelan crisis. What this process would look like, how long will it take, I do have no idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monica. The next speaker is Admiral Chagas Vianna Braga, who is a rear admiral in the Brazilian Navy with extensive field experience. Chagas is currently the commander of the Marine Training Center and School of Naval Peacekeeping. He holds a PhD in International Relations from the Institute of International Relations at the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio, and a master's degree in military studies from the United States Marine Corps University. His field experience includes serving in Haiti as assistant to the First Minister Force Commander, and his main research interest focuses on the question of the use of force on behalf of the international community. He has published on defense strategy, international interventions, and peacekeeping.
Thank you, Paula, for the kind introduction. I'd also like to thank Professor Kenko and Professor Maíra for the invitation to be here today. It's always a great pleasure to come back to PUC. And today it's also very, very special because this is the very room where I defended my PhD. So I have mixed feelings when I entered this room. Anyhow, let's see how it would work. Well, today I want to speak a little bit about the question of the use of force and the future of peacekeeping from a Brazilian perspective. And I start with this slide that there's nothing very new, but It departs from the initial conception of peacekeeping, very light, very soft, and goes all the way up to robust peacekeeping that we are living today. And from the original conception, when we all remember the three basic principles of peacekeeping, partiality, consent, non-use of force, and then it evolved, it arrived at the Capstone Doctrine, and then non-use of force changed to accepting self-defense and defense of the mandate. Actually, in self-defense has always been there, but sometimes even the right of self-defense was denied. If some people remember the question in Rwanda, the Belgian peacekeepers that were there, they were even allowed to use the use of force on self-defense. But now we move it to this thing of on the defense of the mandate, which gives a margin to a lot of stuff that can happen on the defense of the mandate. And then the newest development, I would argue, is the Cruz report, dated 2017. And he speaks about missions operating outside impartiality, consent, and use of force. So if impartiality, consent, and use of force are the base principles of peacekeeping, when we have missions operating outside impartiality, consent, and use of force, are they still peacekeeping? Well, whatever. Troops must be proactive, preemptive, and use overwhelming force. So it's a major departure that we are seeing from the beginning and the way we are right now. A lot of discussion, a lot of debates, a lot of controversies regarding the Cruz report, but it's there. That's the latest UN document. And it should be analyzed not as an isolated fact. It should be analyzed always as the latest initiative in a long search for improvements in peacekeeping. Agenda for Peace, Brahim Report, Capstone Doctrine, New Horizons, Report, etc., etc., etc. So, from the Cruz report perspective, UN structures need to adapt to modern hostile operational environment. That's always the very same thing when we are dealing about those UN reports and things like that. They need to adapt. He argues that the UN flag, blue helmets, and white vehicles do not offer the protection that they were supposed to offer before. So that's a major thing, important thing, and from the field we can see that. Now we have a white vehicle that was supposed to be protective, but when we are being fired at, it's a very nice target. So it's important to understand what we're operating. So the Cruz report is controversial in terms of the use of force, but at the same time it gives a very accurate evaluation of the current status of peacekeeping operations. So I think that's the way one should read the Cruz report. It has a lot of controversial proposals, but gives an accurate status of where we are right now. From a Brazilian perspective, in terms of contemporary peacekeeping, I would argue that our contemporary peacekeeping, just like was mentioned from Professor Monica, it begins with the 2004 MINUSTA. MINUSTA lasted for 13 years. It's the most important development in Brazil's participation in peacekeeping for many different reasons. The very first one is what Chapter 7 was the first time that Brazil actually used force under Chapter 7, so very important. It acted in the full spectrum of military operations, so it alternated periods of concentrated use of force with periods of intense humanitarian assistance. It was a long duration, so it's long for all standards in terms of Brazil. It's a long 13 years. It has a very interesting engagement and coordination with civilian, military, and government and non-government actors that contributed a lot in terms of soft power. And the Brazilian leadership in terms of the military component, not on the overall mission, but in the military component, and the number of troops, 37,000. It's a huge number of troops. In terms, for instance, if you look today in the Brazilian Marine Corps, more than 75% of our officers have peacekeeping experience right now. So it's a major achievement. Then joint multinational interagency operations. So it's very interesting, this kind of coordination. That's the way to go nowadays. And a very high regional engagement, as just mentioned by Professor Monica. At one time, at 2014, we had 79% of MINUSTA troops were troops from Latin America. So it's very important to have this number in mind. And finally, it actually achieved the stabilization of Haiti and left Haiti as a stabilized country much better than it found when just arrived. MINUSTA can be divided for analytical purposes in 6 phases. scholars and would argue the different phases, but in terms of analytical phase, I think this helps a lot in understanding. The deployment phase was until December 2004, from the beginning in May until December. Troops were arriving very slowly. Brazil arrived very fast. Chile was already there. But the level of troops that MINUSTA had was at least 3 times less than the troops of the multinational interim force that was there. So there was a lot of confusion going on, and MINUSTA did not have troops enough to meet the challenge. So this was a complicated period. Then came the confrontation phase, where it lasted until 2007, where MINUSTA actually fought the gangs and fought the spoilers of the peace process. Force was used and really used there. A lot of shots were fired during this period. And then came, after those gangs were defeated, came the stabilization phase, where we had years without a single shot being fired, so it was very interesting years on this thing. And then came the earthquake, and a lot of the progress, we were already talking about ending MINUSTA, then came the earthquake, and a lot of all the progress that was made went all the way down. And in the earthquake's aftermath, we changed the posture from a more use of force posture to exactly a very, very humanitarian. Those components were there all the time, but during some phase there was the preponderance of one component, during the other was this, and after the earthquake we had, of course, the humanitarian thing. And then we had the recovery, and finally the drawdown with the end of the mission on October 2017. The confrontation, as I mentioned, we had a balance of kinetic and non-kinetic action, the full spectrum of conflict, with evolution, creativity, new tactics, and the energetic use of force whenever necessary. That's very important in order to have the credibility of the mission. The next mission I would speak about with UNIFIL. UNIFIL is not new at all. It's still, in terms of organization, it's a traditional UN mission. It started on 1978. On 2006, after the conflict with Israel, we had the creation of the Maritime Task Force. And after 2011, we had Brazil participation as the commander of the Maritime Task Force and with a fighting vessel. The UNIFIL Maritime Task Force has a twofold mission. Basically, it's a maritime interdiction operation to avoid illegal things from entering Lebanon and other areas. It's very complicated because Lebanon sometimes is a way of passage to places like Syria and other. So the sea space there is a very complicated sea space, and also the training of the Lebanese Navy. UNIFIL has a mix and match of a traditional UN peacekeeping force with the Maritime Task Force, which is very unique. Is the only one maritime force operating under the UN. Brazil has the command of the component since 2011. Is a Brazilian admiral. Before that was only NATO admirals that were in charge, and since 2011 Brazil is in charge. That is interesting to see that because it's a fighting vessel, probably the most powerful fighting vessel in the Brazilian Navy. So it's of course it's a robust posture, but at the same time this posture is more related to force protection because it's a very sensitive area, even in terms of terrorism and other things. And minimum use of force because it's still a mission of a mandate that dates from 1978. So it's interesting comparing UNIFIL with MINUSTA. In terms of understand the use of force, I normally use this kind of framework. I think it's very helpful in terms of understanding. We have down on one side 0 use of force and 0 political nature, and then on the other side infinite use of force and infinite political nature. I depart from Clausewitz's concept of absolute war, a war that's perfect. What I mean the perfect in terms of ideal model, that's a single death of infinite use of force. It's abstract, doesn't exist in reality, and we would have enemy, full enemy, infinite violence, and extreme politics. That would be the concept of Clausewitzian war on the one side. And then I propose Then I proposed the concept of absolute peacekeeping that would be just like the Clausewitzian concept. It's an abstract description of peacekeeping. It would be a perfect peacekeeping on the ideal terms that were created after the Cold War. It would be no enemy at all, no use of force, and non-political. That's, of course, it's impossible. The single fact of having military in uniform, there is a use of force that's comprised of there. So it's abstract, just the other one. And then between the two, we have the real world, where everything happens. So they are between them. And then in terms of war, we have limited war and unlimited war, in the spectrum getting close to the war side. And then in terms of peacekeeping, we would have the traditional peacekeeping getting closer but never arriving at the absolute peacekeeping, and robust peacekeeping that moves towards the war side. And then we have this very gray zone where people can describe one thing as peacekeeping. From other perspective, people would say that's intervention, and a lot of things can be talked about that. And then I would argue that UNIFIL is closer to the traditional side. Then we have MINUSTA, that's closer to the robust side. It varies during the phase, it moves one side to the other. And then we are looking at the future challenges in Africa, like MONUSCO, we move down, farther down to the war side of the house. So it's a way of understanding the kind of conflict that we are going in. The use of force, so the key elements, the use of force is a function of the political objectives of the international community. The question of the enemy is crucial in peacekeeping. The absolute peacekeeping, this complex helps in understanding, and this dialect between absolute peacekeeping and absolute war is the way of analyzing the things. Friction and other intangibles that are present in war are also present in peacekeeping operations. The more force you use, the more present they will be, and this kind of tertiary trinity that belongs to legitimacy. I will not spend a lot of time in the thing of trinity, but we have the Clausewitzian trinity, and when we are dealing with the use of force in the national community, this trinity changes in terms of populations, governance, and military, paramilitary, and non-military forces. And then, getting very close to the conclusion, the use of force in peacekeeping is not a trivial problem, although it's an essential tool. It's very important in terms of protection of civilians, and the mandates must be not too ambitious in terms of the use of force. The distinction between peacekeeping and war fighting, it turns very gray when we are using force. The more force we are using, the grayer this distinction turn. And after, also there are results and collateral consequences. So we may achieve some results in terms of the mandate, but then we have collateral consequences not only inside the mission, but also outside the mission. What I mean, for instance, if we start using force in one mission, then UN in that area is seen as non-impartial, and then the UN can be affected in other areas. I'd like to mention UNDOF, one of the oldest UN missions that was very quiet, everything was going on, and then came the crisis in Syria, the crisis in Iraq, and the mission was attacked. So it's one of the things that we always have to bear in mind. Some practical thoughts, practical implications. As I said, blue helmets and white vehicles, they were symbols of protections. Now, maybe not. In MINUSCA, we had 2 Brazilian officers that were driving a UN white vehicle, and they were attacked exactly because they were driving a UN white vehicle. So it's important to see this kind of things. The protection, some countries have caveats regarding Chapter 7. Even Brazil, there are many discussions between the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs regarding the Chapter 7. People are not comfortable in saying that we are operating under Chapter 7 as we did in Haiti. The relationship with the peace partners and humanitarian spaces. The more force you use, more difficult is the relationship with the peace partners. It's a whole conversation regarding this subject, but it's very important to see that. It's a fact. And the problem of consent and legitimacy, not only inside the host nation, but also among the international community. So this is very important when they're talking about the question of the use of force. Nevertheless, it is still a very important tool in terms of the credibility of the mission. The very first slide now, Brazil and contemporary peacekeeping. We have a lot of internal debates and dilemmas, as I just mentioned. Brazil was preparing to send troops to MINUSCA. The troops were pretty much ready to go. It was a battalion composed of Army and Marine Corps troops. It was pretty much ready to go. From the MOD perspective, it was a go. Then there were some restrictions inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But then we had some domestic issues here with first of all, with the security operations in Rio, and then came the federal intervention in Rio de Janeiro state, and then the political climate to send troops overseas when you have some problems here became too complicated. Although the troops were completely different, one would not affect the other at all, but the political climate turned this thing complicated. So we think this was postponed. I don't know exactly when it will happen, but from the armed force perspective, we are ready to go wherever Brazil decides that we should go. And the main future challenge for us is that there is an international trend, as you could see, not only from the Cruz report, but also from the RIPO, towards more robust operation and more use of force. And that's what Brazil should be prepared to deal with when going into further operations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chagas. Hello. Hi. Wow, okay, so our next speaker is Danilo Marcondes, assistant professor at the Brazilian War College in Rio de Janeiro. He has a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge and was a Prodefesa postdoctoral research at the University of Pontifício Católico University of Rio de Janeiro here at IRI. Danilo has contributed to articles and book chapters on Brazilian foreign policy and on Brazilian international security, especially regarding peacekeeping operations in the South Atlantic space.
So, 1 second. Just make a small change. Okay. Hello. So, good morning. Thank you, Paula, for the introduction. As the previous speakers have emphasized, it's also a great pleasure for me to be here. I did my undergrad and my master's here, so it's a great pleasure to be here at PUC again, presenting on peacekeeping, which is a topic that I've learned a lot from basically everyone in the table and Kai as well, right? So it's a real honor to be here and share some of my thoughts on peacekeeping with you, but particularly with the undergraduate students. So my presentation focuses on the current moment, right? The period after the end of MINUSTAH, and particularly the scenario for the South American states. And I'm going to emphasize in the presentation particularly the engagement of these South American states with UN peacekeeping in Africa, right? So just some initial thoughts. All South American troop contributing countries, with the exception of Ecuador, are at the moment involved in MINUSCA, right, at the UN Stabilization Mission in the Central African Republic. They're involved in different capacities, and I'll show you a slide with more detail on that. And none of the South American troop contributing countries are involved in the mission in Mali, right, which is the deadliest UN mission at the moment. And in fact, there was an invitation for Brazil to send troops to Mali a few years ago, but the Brazilian authorities decided that this was not going to be the case. It's also important to emphasize when we're looking at South America that Guyana, Suriname, and Venezuela do not contribute troops or staff officers or experts on missions to UN peacekeeping. And it's interesting that Monica alluded to the UN missions in Central America in the 90s, because that was the last time that Venezuela participated. And there's also an interesting anecdote that Hugo Chavez was a peacekeeper in Onuca, right, in the early 1990s. Also important to highlight that Colombia is the only country here in South America that hosts a UN mission, not a peacekeeping mission, but a political mission. Right? And I'll make some considerations about the role of Colombia in peacekeeping. As you probably know, the end of MINUSTA meant a significant reduction of the South American participation in UN peacekeeping. In the case of Brazil, MINUSTA represented over 90% of the participation in peacekeeping missions. And of course, the end of MINUSTA also created this issue with the experience that was accumulated by Brazil, by Argentina, by Chile, Uruguay, and other Latin American countries in MINUSTA, and the possibility of transferring this experience to other future engagements, right? And I'm alluding to the research that Maíra and Ricardo and I have been developing on that. So in terms of the way that South American countries are participating in UN peacekeeping, so I've gathered the data from the UN database, from the DPKO database. These are figures from the end of April, the most updated ones that we have so far. And I've highlighted the UN missions in Africa, right, in red, so that you could see the significance of the contribution. And what you can see from, and I'll show you the other countries in a second, is that the contributions are very spread out in different missions, right? Only in a few countries we have a smaller number of missions, right? So if you look at Brazil and Argentina, very, very spread out into different missions, right? And also, as the Admiral mentioned, the case of UNIFIL, which is our current troop contribution, is also relevant to bear in mind, because it has an impact on the possibility of future engagements, including in Africa as well. Right? So that's the case of Chile, Uruguay, which has an extensive presence, troop contributing presence in the mission in the Congo since 1999, right? Since before the mission changed its name. So there's a lot of accumulated Uruguayan experience regarding the participation in the DRC. Case of Bolivia, case of Colombia, which as I mentioned has its own hosts, its own UN mission. In the cases of Peru and Ecuador, which I think it's also interesting to highlight because of their contribution to peacekeeping, all of the contributions is to missions in Africa. So it's a bit different from the other South American countries. They're not in the political mission in Colombia, for example, as is the case of Brazil.
Because they're neighbors.
Yes, exactly. And in terms of a more general analysis of this participation, I think it's important to highlight, and I thought it was very interesting what Professor Paul Williams mentioned in his presentation yesterday. So where do South American states fit in, right? Because they're not permanent members of the Security Council, right? They're not making the decisions about the mandates, right? They are not financing these missions, and they are not the largest contributors, right? At least not now. So, but at the same time, they fit within what British Professor Philip Cunliffe has talked about, the global division of labor regarding peacekeeping missions, right? And how countries of the global north draft the mandates, provide the financial resources, but countries of the global south are contributing with troops, right? And this is a case of not only South American states, but countries from Africa and from the Indian subcontinent as well, right? But South American states also have a very particular foreign policy identity, right? Because they want to be seen as members of the international community, right? As democratic countries, as countries that have a positive contribution to international peace and security. And I think Monica alluded to some of these considerations in her own presentation, right? This idea that these countries can be considered as global good Samaritans, right? Which is taken from Alison Briggs' book called Global Good Samaritans, which has a picture of a Brazilian peacekeeper holding a baby in the cover. So I think it's interesting to highlight that component, right? So this idea that, and I think that this is particularly relevant for Colombia, right? So I've done some research on the Colombian decision to participate in UN peacekeeping, and you have this idea that for Colombia, after decades of civil war, after decades of conflict, being able now to participate in UN peacekeeping is a sign of being a normal country, right? Being a country that can provide a positive contribution to international peace and security. Of course, the Colombians haven't deployed troops yet, but I think this is something that is in the horizon for the long term at least. I think it's also important to highlight that South American countries have been active within the UN system, including serving non-permanent seats in the Security Council. And this, of course, has a connection with participating in UN peacekeeping, right? Because when you are in the Security Council, though you're not a permanent member, right, all the eyes of the international community are looking at you, right? And so there's this expectation that you're going to contribute actively to international peace and security. And I'm highlighting the role of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, which have served for the largest period of time in the Security Council, right? And then have been, at least Argentina and Brazil, Chile, have been active participants in peacekeeping missions, right? And I think that it's also important to highlight the case of Uruguay, right? Because Uruguay, up until a few years ago, was a very large contributor, right after African countries and the countries of the Indian subcontinent. And this has allowed Uruguay to also participate in Security Council meetings discussing particularly the MONUSCO mission, right? Because Uruguay is a significant contributor to that mission. So, and then the specific case of Africa, I think it's interesting to also point out that participating in missions in Africa is also anchored on broader foreign policy relations between South American states and African states. And I would like to highlight the PACAs first, so the South Atlantic Zone of Peace and Cooperation, which was created in the late 1980s, but was revived in 2007, in which Brazil has a key role in making it a more relevant institution, for example. Also the Africa-South American Summit, which was created in 2006 under a joint Brazil-Nigeria leadership. And of course the problem with these regional initiatives is they are connected to Brazilian leadership, right? So basically the foreign policy agenda towards Africa that existed during the PT administration, right? Again, important to highlight the issues with gaps in participation, right? Chile participated in MONUSCO in 2003, and then it ended participation. Only returned to peacekeeping in Africa by participating in MONUSCO in 2016, so it's a significant 13 years gap. Again, limited diplomatic presence on the part of South American states in the African continent, with the exception of Brazil, and this is a contrast with the case of Haiti, where the South American diplomats in Port-au-Prince were very active in the negotiations with the Haitian government. Also the issue of high visibility, which existed in MINUSTA, and in the case of the missions in Africa, as I showed, the contributions are all diluted, right? Contributions concentrated in specific missions, as in the case of Uruguay in the Congo, Peru in the Central African Republic. Case of Brazil, there's no true contribution, but Brazil leads the country-specific configuration on Guinea-Bissau within the UN Peacebuilding Commission, so it's an important contribution in that aspect. Again, as Danilo mentioned, there is, in the case of South American states, the constant need to reaffirm and renegotiate the importance of participating in peacekeeping missions with the legislative chambers in those countries and with other sectors of the government, right? And particularly in light of domestic demands, right? So opposition parties normally tend to want to reduce or end with certain troop contributions, right? There's also the issue of unfulfilled agendas, right? So in 2009, there was this interest that Brazil and South Africa could participate together in missions in Africa, but this agenda was not developed any further. There's the interesting case of Colombia, right, in providing security assistance and security cooperation to countries in West Africa, particularly to address drug trafficking, right, which is a non-UN contribution. The issue of deployment to sensitive missions, as I mentioned, Uruguay, the Congo, which creates a certain fatigue, right, have been there for over 18 years. Right? Now we're going to have again, for the second time, a Brazilian force commander within MONUSCO. There's also the issue of the Peruvian participation with an engineering company in the Central African Republic. Again, limited role in terms of the engagement with the African Union, right? Only Brazil has an active diplomatic presence in Addis Ababa, and only Brazil is really able to interact with the African Union in terms of issues related to peace and security. Of course, participating in missions in Africa creates opportunities for engagement with non-Latin American, non-South American forces. So I'm alluding to an event in which Uruguayan troops acted jointly with South African troops within MONUSCO. As the way I see it, there are opportunities for future engagement in UN missions in Africa. So Peru is still going to be in the Security Council for next year, and then Peru is engaged in the Central African Republic with a quite relevant role in that mission. Brazil is likely to begin a term in the Security Council in 2022, so this might create an incentive for a future engagement in a UN peacekeeping mission in Africa. There is, in the case of Brazil, as the Admiral mentioned, a certain a lack of clarity in terms of what would that future commitment to UN missions in Africa would be. And then, of course, we are engaged in Lebanon, which also creates some logistical demands that have to be fulfilled. And I think that the last point I would mention for the specific case of Brazil is related to the research that Ricardo, Maíra, and I have been developing, is this idea that although Brazil is not deployed in any UN mission in Africa, it can assist and can cooperate with African countries in training for peacekeeping. And this is the research that we have been doing now. And we can expand on that in the Q&A. So just to conclude, it's important to highlight that the experience that South American countries had with UN missions in Africa in the 80s, in the 90s, is very different from the missions that we have today, right? The stabilization missions, the missions that involve robust peacekeeping and active use of force. And of course, there are also two more general issues that have to be taken into consideration. First, the need to define what's the role and what's the place of Africa in in the foreign policy strategy of different South American countries, not only Brazil, but also Argentina, Colombia, Chile, and etc. Right? And within that discussion, also to define what's the real willingness, right? The political incentive, as well as the capacity to contribute to the maintenance of peace and security in the African continent.
Thank you, Danilo. Last but not least, we have Maíra Siman. Maíra holds a Master's in International Studies with emphasis in Political Science at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, Geneva, and a PhD in International Relations from the Pontifical Catholic University here in Rio de Janeiro. And Maíra acts as assistant professor here also at ED. Thank you, Maíra.
Thank you, Paula. So, first, I'd like to say for you that have your programs, the programs in your hand, I'm not Ivan Briscoe. So Ivan could not join us. He's in Bogota right now, work for Crisis Group, but he's suffering from huge back pains since Sunday. He was supposed to be with us on Monday for a workshop, but he could not come, but he said he will be really glad to join us next time. So I won't be talking about Colombia. So I'm sure if questions exist about Colombia, I'm sure Monica have great ideas on this. Maria Elena is here. Manuel is not here, but we might even try to bring some ideas. So I just have one slide, just to say that I don't have a PowerPoint. Happening there. Yeah. Just one. Yeah. Okay, just to say this slide, the picture is not good, but this picture I took in 2012 in Haiti, inside the UN base, where the Brazilian battalion was deployed. So you just can see, but it's like the two streets inside the base with Avenida Brasil and Avenida Haiti, with the mottos of the flags, the national flags. And I put our motto, order and progress, and the slogan of the Brazilian Army, strong arm, friendly hand. And those two mottos are helping me to think through MINUSTA, but also our the current engagement of the Army in public security here in Rio. So part of the ideas I'll present today were developed last year with my co-author, Victoria Santos. She's not here right now. She's working a lot with us all these days. She is a PhD student here at Rio, working at GSOM, and has a very, very, very great thesis going on. And we published this article just in the beginning of this year, I think February, entitled Interrogating the Security Development Nexus in Brazil's Domestic and Foreign Pacification Engagements. So this article was written, of course, last year at the time that Brazilian armed forces were still deployed in the UN mission in Haiti, but already preparing to leave the country with the end of the mission. And at the same moment, the UN was making pressure to Brazil to send troops to MINUSCA in the Central African Republic, as we've talked already today. So we wrote this article looking at the growing militarization of urban security in Brazil, and approached specifically the engagement of security actors in general in the now almost defunct police pacification program initiated in 2008 here in Rio de Janeiro. And I say almost defunct because just yesterday the current Secretary of Security of Rio, General Richard Muniz, affirmed that he does not intend to extinguish all the police pacification units. Those that work will be preserved and will receive more investments. So according to him, the expansions of the UPPs, the Unidade de Polícia Pacificadora, a unit of police pacification units, was guided by electoral interest, and only now he can make such a criticism, he's saying, because we live in a federal intervention, and he would have not have been allowed to say this in another situation. So while in this article with Victoria, I was trying to look at the Brazilian engagement through the motto of our national flag. I'm now with Victoria too, trying to to look at the present situation, not only of our disengagement in MINUSTA, but also possible future engagements as we were discussing today, and the engagement of the Army in public security through the slogan of the Brazilian Army. So it's a research we just started. So we are looking at how the Brazilian Army has been constructed, perceived, and valued internally and externally as a force prepared to perform a dual mandate, as expressed in this official slogan, Braço Forte Mão Amiga, in which we see a combination between two domains of expertise, using force against the enemy and conducting or supporting governance and humanitarian tasks at home and abroad. So, coming back to the article I wrote with Victoria, we were looking at the several interpretations that were articulated by academics, diplomats, policymakers, to give meaning to the Brazilian military engagement in MINUSTA. And one concern, it's one of those narratives constructed to try to make sense of this engagement, concerns the widely and frequently proclaimed relationship with public security pacification programs undertaken in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro since 2008 under the name of UPP. So in fact, the idea of a Port-au-Prince-Rio connection has been widely discussed by civilian and military specialists that have looked for synergy effects, the word they use usually, between MINUSTA and public security in Brazil. So studies comparing these two contexts have discussed, for instance, the adoption of innovative military strategies of territorial occupation, the effects and dilemmas of giving police power to the armed forces, and the relationship between militaries and the occupied, pacified communities, among several other points. So attempts to establish this relationship between Haiti and Rio, here and there, have tended to follow an intricate two-side story. On one side of the story, Brazil's leading position in MINUSTA is analyzed as part of a well-designed foreign policy strategy for the Brazilian Army, not only to enhance its budget, but also to improve its operational logistical knowledge and learn groundbreaking methods of engagement in UN-led operations. As a consequence of this foreign policy movement, Brazilian security actors have been able to transfer methods, first experimenting the pacification of areas in Port-au-Prince, to pacification projects implemented here in Rio. On the other side of the story, certain scholars have elaborated a narrative of knowledge and expertise transfer that goes the other way around, right? When consider the regional point of departure of this Rio-Haiti connection. So instead of conceiving the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti as a kind of a trigger for pacification programs in Rio, both in terms of the knowledge acquired or a broader political legitimation process for the controversial deployment of the army in the context of public security programs, the engagement in MINUSTA is analyzed as an opportunity to the armed forces to export Brazilian public security policies, such as the use of the military to address urban violence related to drug trafficking. The participation in the UN mission is therefore conceived as a chance for Brazilian troops to pass abroad their conventional policing roles and their previous acquaintance with operations called Guaranteeing Law and Order, GLO, in which, as we are facing this week, and in the past months, the military are called to contain disturbance of the public order, right? So we argue that those two explanations by those two stories usually go together in a chicken-egg situation. So in an attempt to avoid this circular and more restricted mode of thinking, the article approached the so-called MINUSTA-UPP connection through the lens of a security development nexus mobilized in these two specific contexts of security practice and through the policies and priorities which have been legitimated by such mobilizations. So I won't be talking about the different constructions of this nexus historically, but it's enough to say that once underdevelopment came to be considered a source of danger and risk, a security development nexus is mobilized in favor of a range of security practices oriented toward the prevention of violence, the containment of violence also, the empowerment of vulnerable groups, and the building of resilient communities. So the literature says that while in the 90s we had security practices, international security practices, often carry a sense of protection and social transformation, such as through the predominance of this liberal peace, interventionist peace paradigm, which of course is compatible with the notion of both humanitarian intervention but also, of course, peace building, the 2000s brought actions which had increasingly limited goals, most based on a paradigm of resilience, especially in the context of so-called stabilization missions. We'll be talking about this the last 2 days, right? So, although stabilization is still considered a very ambiguous term, military development and civilian actors have tended to interpret it as a set of discrete activities entailing everything from little operations to the provision of target aid and investments in basic governing institutions of so-called fragile states, or could be fragile cities, most often associated with the maintenance of domestic order, so the police, the military, and the rule of law. So it's common to say, Rob Maga, for instance, says the stabilizers are those that wear multiple hats, killing and capturing opposition elements in the morning and promoting community development in the afternoon. So in the context of UN peace support operation, the term stabilization has gained growing resonance since the operation deployed in Haiti, 2004, MINUSA, and presently we have 3 missions with this S in the name. So DRC, Mali, and Central African Republic. So stabilization have been implemented in contexts where there is neither an ongoing nor a durable peace or consensual peace agreement, and where the UN has engaged in combating conflict, insurgency, and other forms of violence, and such as criminal gangs. So some specialists note that this would be kind of a transition model from very big operation, large-scale operations to very small and temporary security development package, let's say. So it's interesting to look at is how in the contemporary military literature and security literature, the term stabilization has been used interchangeably with pacification, the word we use in Brazil, for instance, counterinsurgency, proximity, and community police. This state of affairs is related to the fact that all terms emphasize, among other factors, the centrality of the population as an object of control, and therefore a connection between the deployment of violence and attempts to act or through the human or social terrain, right? So according to Patricia Owens, who works at Like Lot, pacification wars are wars of domestication, in the sense that counterinsurgencies seek to govern through strategies of household rule, and it is a form of war justified in part through domestic images and sentiments. So in this sense, pacification and counterinsurgency are analyzed as practices of armed social work, which hold the social and the domestic as its fields of operation. So in MINUSA, we've been talking this also, and it was good to see other colleagues mentioning how Brazil has engaged in there, trying to articulate a specific interpretation of the mandate, approaching the UN mission from a broader perspective, including security, reconciliation, and development, although MINUSA does not have development in its official mandate. It's not a peace-building operation, it's, as with the S in the name, it's a stabilization mission operation, but Brazilian authorities, our Foreign Minister, have frequently emphasized that we were doing both development and stabilization and development in Haiti. So this narrative of this nexus in Haiti have been reproduced in several literature, but looking at what were the practices that were mobilized through this understanding, we see, well, first, on the one hand, we know for the first time a Security Council resolution mentioned that, and Brazil was really behind all this, having a mission that had combating poverty as one of the main goals of the mission. So according to Antônio Jorge Ramalho, MINUSA was distinct from previous missions deployed in Haiti because of, among other factors, the way Brazilian military engagement was conducted. So he said for the first time we saw Brazilians, a UN mission, working for the first time to bring benefits for the society, respecting the limits placed on the rules of engagement, but also, of course, using force when necessary. But the first time we could see a mission doing he's using a package of social services and many words related to this during their activities when patrolling, for instance, poor neighborhoods in Haiti. So what we know is that Brazil has been the mission, the trip that have most made use of quick impact projects in Haiti. Those projects are considered very specific and localized social projects, such as street cleaning, garbage collection, etc. And of course, what we see is this that humanitarian civilian actions fits a winning hearts and minds framework in which capacity building and humanitarian activities are undertaken in order to gain the support of the local population. So there are several activities that we list and important doing also mainly to the Brazilian Engineering Battalion, and that even made some authors saying that Brazil had Brazilianized CIMIC, UN CIMIC, making it more strategic to the mission. So there is a debate on this, and I think it's also an interesting aspect to see how the UN saw this too. And so what we see, there is a very specific reading of the Secure Development Nexus, which obeys a progressive and linear logic in which development is located in a later moment when public order, understood as the production of an environment considered normal in terms of the level of criminality, is achieved. So once this development enterprise or our progress is constantly suspended, security engagements are conceived as channels for building resilient communities. So the connections between Haiti and Rio can be found not only in the deployment of Brazilian armed forces, but also in an underlying mobilization of the Security Development Nexus. This causes about a connection between poverty and criminality that enables the prioritization of order and the limitation of development engagements to practice of armed social work, as seen in relief assistance and projects aimed to support community resilience and small-scale reconstruction. I won't have time to talk about UPP. Most of you know about a bit about this project and how it included initially the UPP Social, the social arm of UPP that never happened, and we are not expecting this social part to happen soon. And so we also did the same thing in terms of analyzing how this nexus is mobilized in terms of the security engagements and the pacification projects here in Rio. So I'll jump a little bit, but just to conclude, today I was reading Juliana Pinheiro's PhD dissertation, and she's saying that in Brazil, the conflation of issues like policing, peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, and social development is seen as unproblematic, or even as an asset. Indeed, the motto of the Brazilian army is Braço Forte, Mão Amiga, strong arm and friendly hand, signaling the multiple roles that the army does and should have once installed in a community. Moreover, the army is mostly seen as managing these multiple roles well, while generally being regarded as one of the institutions in society that Brazilians most trust the most. The police, on the other hand, are generally seen as brutal and corrupt. So our aim now in this new research is to analyze the historical conditions which have allowed for the Brazilian armed forces to be constructed as an essential part of the solution, both for international context calling for stabilization mission, such was the invitation to Brazil to take part in the Central African Republic mission, or for domestic contexts of criminality. We want to reflect on how the dominant understanding and practices of the treaty of violence and crime in Brazil as a problem to be managed and solved by the military might be increasingly compatible with international stabilization mandates recently authorized by the UN mission, by the United Nations. So we were particularly interested in understanding the ways in which a logic of counterinsurgency has enabled a convergence between the military expertise required in both contexts of peace operations and public security, allowing for domestic and foreign Brazilian military engagements to be mobilized as source of legitimacy for each other. And for those from abroad, I just want to add, because it's an interesting way of looking at it, now we have General Santos Cruz as the current National Secretary of Public Security, right? So in this process, what we want to look at is precisely the possible other problematizations of violence, which would enable us to try to look for solutions that do not go through such a counterinsurgency logic, and how make them visible. And I think those two slogans and mottos help us to look through this and problematize and articulate a different criticism, but also different ways of thinking through the security development nexus in Brazil. Thank you.